Hello everyone and welcome to our latest webinar, The Beginner's Guide to Working with RAW. Thanks for joining us. My name is Rob Newton and I'm your host for this session. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Payne, Head of Technology for Holdan. Hello Richard.
Hello Rob, thanks for having me.
All right, how are you today?
Fine, thanks.
Good. Right. Richard has worked in video and media production for over 30 years as a cameraman, editor, director and producer with companies such as the BBC, BT, Daxo and Eurostar. So vast knowledge and experience. So we're really great to have him here today.
Thanks a lot.
Before we get started, I just want to go through some housekeeping. On your screens there's a question box and we would really like you to use the question box. We want to make the presentation as engaging as possible and obviously for you to get the most value out of it, ask plenty of questions and we'll answer them either throughout the webinar or right at the end. We'll make sure we get them all answered for you. We are recording this webinar, so if you want to review it later on, there wasn't something you wanted to either pass on to your colleagues or you didn't quite understand, as I say, we will be sending out a link tomorrow so that you can relive it all over again. You may not know that actually we run some open days and masterclass sessions here in Teddington where you can actually get your hands on the kit. In fact, we're doing a Blackmagic demo van day on the 1st of December, which will include the DaVinci Resolve and the range of 4K cameras that they've got, including the Ursa Mini 4K, the new one. So if you like what you hear today in terms of working with RAW from Richard and you want to sit in front of a demo artist and a colorist.
A proper colorist on that trip, yeah.
Yes, I didn't like to say that, Richard, but thank you. Then certainly, that's the date to keep in mind, the 1st of December. And access to that is via our website, which of course is www.visuals.co.uk, and go on to the events page. Right, there's just one more thing. If you wouldn't mind, we have an audience poll. This will help Richard adapt the presentation to profile of the audience. So it's quite a simple question. Basically, are you shooting in RAW yet? And we've got 4 options for you to choose from. Yes, already there, I'm shooting in RAW and using it. No, but I know I need to soon. No, but we need to do it, but we haven't quite got round to either getting the camera or working out how to operate it yet. Or number 4, I'm not convinced of the benefits of RAW. Obviously, it takes up a lot of data on your memory stick, so it could be that you're a bit apprehensive and you need some convincing. So hopefully today's session and possibly the open day on the 1st of December will help you with that. So if you could just click on your options, we'll actually see if we've got anyone there. There's no one actually clicked yet. So, all right, here we go. Yeah, we've got some already. Excellent. So the majority, it seems, it's quite split actually. The majority are already shooting RAW, but we've also got an awful lot who are not convinced of the benefits. So, as I said, that's fine. At least we know that we've got plenty of other people who you need a bit more information, which is what today's about, of course. So thanks for doing that. We'll just close that. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, I'd like to hand over now to Richard, who will begin the presentation.
Thanks, Rob. So first of all, I'd like to say thanks for listening to this. I work for Holdan and we're the UK distributor for both Blackmagic Design and Panasonic Broadcast. So I'm going to talk about my experience with both of those cameras. Now, I know there are other cameras that record RAW, but the specific ones I'm talking about are Panasonic and Blackmagic. And the Panasonic cameras that I'm going to talk about aren't actually RAW recording, but I want to talk a little about the difference between RAW and log to clear up some confusion. So it's this webinar, I designed it to be written for beginners who are considering working with RAW, so that 37% already using it, you'll have to bear with me, but hopefully there'll be something useful in it for you. And Experienced DaVinci Resolve users should leave now. Please leave the building. Please turn it off, go off, have a cup of tea, save the time, because I haven't really used DaVinci much. I've been using it for a couple of years, dipping in and out of it. But as I said, this is designed for beginners, not experienced colorists. So experienced colorists, leave the building, please. So thanks very much. Now, about Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve, which I'm going to talk about here, it was originally designed as a grading package, just purely for grading, but more and more editing features have been added, especially with the release of version 12. So it now can be considered both for grading and editing. It's free of charge. The standard version is free of charge on Mac or PC. So this is an amazing thing that Blackmagic have done. A program which was, you couldn't get for less than $250,000 a few years ago is now given away. And the free version is capable of a huge amount of stuff. I will talk about the differences between the free and the paid for versions. Excellent. Now, so in fact, the full studio version comes with the Blackmagic cameras like the Ursa Mini, the full Ursa, the cinema cameras. It doesn't come with the pocket camera, but everything higher end comes with the full version of DaVinci Resolve. So you get a dongle, and that version will let you do some high-end noise reduction. So noise reduction can be very useful. It's got both temporal and spatial noise reduction. So you can, very good ways of getting, if you're shooting high ISO or you're shooting in very low light conditions, the noise reduction is brilliant, and it's something you will want to get out of it. There are a few other nuances between the free version and the full one about collaboration and sharing projects, but for most people, the only thing you'll miss is that noise reduction. Right. There are many tutorials out there, and I'm actually going to recommend one a couple of times in this as a brilliant start, beginner's start, end-to-end DaVinci 12 tutorial. So keep a note of the link I'll give you, because it really helped me get to grips with DaVinci, and I hope it does the same for you. But if you just Google DaVinci tutorial, you will be spoilt for choice. Now, you do need a decent spec Mac or PC. I can talk a little more about this when we go into detail, but especially if you're shooting 4K, the specification of your Macs and PCs are going to be vital to getting the best out of DaVinci. You can just grade a single frame on some old piece of junk you've had in your loft, and you'll be amazed that you'll just have to be patient with it. And so I'll talk about a little more detail on specifications later, because that is a fairly dull thing, but obviously vital. Now, an important thing I think is to consider using a monitor and a television when you're grading, because your laptop screen or your desktop screen may not be showing you the right frame rate, the right refresh rate, and the right colors compared with the audience who might be watching us on a 4K television or on a whatever platform, even in a cinema eventually. So it's very important to be monitoring your output from DaVinci. So if you use DaVinci, you'll obviously, one of the reasons they've given it to you is they're tying you into using the Blackmagic output cards with DaVinci, but it's not as expensive as you might think. On the left-hand side of the screen there, you can see there's a Panasonic, just happened to be a Panasonic 4K television, will cost you about £500 for a 40-inch, and that's UHD. 3840 by 2160 resolution, but obviously this may be what the majority of your audience are going to watch your video on. So seeing what the color, seeing what it looks like on the screen is a very good idea. Yeah. And you only need a Blackmagic intensity card, which is about £120 in your PC to be able to output 4K from DaVinci straight to a screen like that. Underneath that, I've got a little mini monitor, which is a little under £100 device. So if you've got a Mac with Thunderbolt out, it will give you an HD output through HDMI and SDI. So even if you're shooting 4K, it's a good idea to monitor on a decent HD monitor. So £99 will buy you the output device from your Thunderbolt device, whether it's a Mac or PC. Now, personally, I use the Ultra Studio 4K at the bottom on the right there with my HP laptop. So my HP laptop is a ZBook, it has Thunderbolt out, and this gives me the ability to give both SDI, 6 gig SDI output, so up to 30 frames in SDI, UHD output, but also it gives me HDMI output as well. And you've also got the ability to capture through this, and about £600 or so, so this isn't a very expensive device. And up the top of the screen there, I've got a Blackmagic 17-inch UHD monitor, which is an 8-bit monitor, but very high quality, and that will cost about £1,200 or so. So 4K monitoring on the professional side, yes, costs a bit more, but on the more domestic side, using an intensity and a UHD television won't necessarily cost you the earth, but it's very important because all the time you're working with these files, you get a live output, so you can see what you're doing with instant feedback on the sort of screen your audience is going to play it back on. So, RAW and log. I was quite pleased with those photos. And what I want to talk a little about the differences, because sometimes I found I was blurring talking the differences between RAW and log, so I thought it was a good idea to explain it. So excuse me if I'm teaching my grandmother how to suck eggs with this bit. RAW video has absolutely no processing baked into it at all. So RAW video is sensor data exactly as it comes off the sensor, a bunch of noughts and ones. It is wrapped. Normally the Blackmagic RAW is 12-bit, so there is some sort of elementary compression going on, but it's naked data coming off the sensor. Log data is flat contrast video that has things like white balance and ISO baked into it. You can't change white balance and ISO so easily with log as you can with RAW. So log is different to RAW. RAW is a lot bigger files with a lot more nuances, a lot more subtlety. So both RAW and log are designed to get the most out of the sensor, but RAW will give you more than log. So both RAW and log can be uncompressed. A lot of people think that you can't compress RAW, but you can. And Blackmagic give you a 3:1 compression option on their cameras, which makes the RAW a lot more manageable. However, it does also need a bit higher spec to be able to work with it. Because it's compressed, you've got to decompress each frame before you work with it. So I'm going to talk a little more about log because I've recently been playing a lot with the Panasonic DVX200, which just arrived with me and I'm very fond of. So cameras like the Varicam, the DVX200, and even the GH4 can use this V-Log gamma. On the Varicam you get 15 stops of dynamic range, but they don't let me play with that very often. So with the DVX200 and the GH4R is the version which has log built in, or you can upgrade your GH4 to get V-Log. With Panasonic, you get 12 stops using the V-Log mode, which is more dynamic range than you can get standardly out of those cameras. So I did some shooting with a DVX200 and I'll show you the results in a minute. Blackmagic cameras refer to log as film dynamic range. So what Panasonic refer to as V-Log or V-Log Lite, Blackmagic refer to as film dynamic range, but it's effectively log. It's the same thing. So the whole idea of log is you're increasing the dynamic range. You're getting more detail into your highlights and shadows. So there's more detail across the whole image. Gives you some workable stuff. You can pull detail out of your shadows. You can get detail in skies. It requires you to do a bit of work. Now you can actually work with log stuff in any editing package just by increasing the saturation and the contrast and having a fiddle with level controls. You can get a similar result to DaVinci, but DaVinci gives you a lot more nuances, a lot more subtlety of control over it. You'll be able to do it better in DaVinci. And the whole idea of the log gamma is it makes video more filmic. That wider dynamic range stops you getting that awful blown out skies, that lack of detail, which really gives away if you used a cheap camcorder. So, very importantly, log doesn't take up any more memory than, it's not like RAW where it's going to eat through your cards. Log is, because it's compressed in exactly the same way, because it's a proper video signal, log is going to take up as much room as standard video when you're encoding it. So either in MPEG-4 or ProRes. The Blackmagic cameras encode into ProRes. Cameras like the DVX200, GH4, they're into MPEG-4. So here's my log example, which is exactly the same shot. I took this last week. The sun came out briefly, and I shot up to Devil's Dyke near Brighton to get these shots. And the top one, I used the Panasonic Scene File 5, just same exposure for both of these. And the bottom one is a Vlog Lite Gamma, which I've done a little adjustment in DaVinci. Now you have to trust me on this for these two shots, but there was no way of getting the same detail out of the 709 Gamma shot, the traditional contrast range shot on the top, than there is out of the Vlog. It just isn't there. That detail isn't there. And to prove that, DaVinci Resolve has these handy waveforms and scopes for analyzing your video in a bit more detail. I do find waveforms incredibly useful, and I use them also on cameras for judging exposure. And you can clearly see that the log gamma down the bottom, by the way, to read a waveform like this, you've got the bright areas of the screen are up the top, the dark areas are down at the bottom, and the detail across the shot is sort of running left to right. So if something's in the middle of the waveform, it's in the middle of the picture. So where you can see the little mountain range in the center here, that's the detail in this cloud here. There's more subtlety, there's more information in that part of the screen. And generally across the highlights, you can see there's much more gradation across the highlights than there is on the log gamma, sorry, on the 709 Gamma up the top.
Yes. That's quite incredible, isn't it? The difference between the two.
And it's such a, but I was almost shooting into the sun here. The sun was about here, but it was so much more pleasing.
Yeah.
Now I don't think I'd use log for every shot, because apart from anything else, you have to fiddle with it afterwards. You have to play with it. You have to do a bit of work on it afterwards. And to be honest, with a run and gun camera type like the DVX200, you might just want to be turning stuff around quickly and not fiddling. But any shot where you're going to need dynamic range, where you've got people against windows, you've got backgrounds which might get blown out, in-car stuff, things like that, it's a fantastic tool to have in the box. And for those situations, I definitely use it. Right. So when I went into the log example, you need to convert your log into a standard gamma in order to see it on a monitor. Otherwise, the images look very grey, very flat, look like you shot them on a very misty day. So
is that quite easy to do?
The simplest way to do is cheat. And what I did was I did a bit of a search online. I looked at a few websites, and I chose a 3D lookup table, which I like the look of. There's actually a 3D lookup table is almost like, what's the best way of describing it? It's a mathematical chart that changes the color of pixels from one thing to another. It'll allow you to convert, red to blue and blue to red if you take it to its nth degree. But a 3D lookup table is a subtle way of transforming colors. You're just telling it to take this pixel of this color and make it into another color. Now, if you get a clever colorist with an artistic bent who's willing to put their interpretation of how you should grade their log stuff, they can come up with looks for you. Or you can download for nothing some looks from people online. And I found this Vlog corrector on a website, which is for taking GH4 footage or DVX200 footage and doing a nice sort of, without having to change colors or anything else, gives you a nice starting point from which you can always pull out more detail from the shadows or highlights or tweak it. So using 3D color correctors, 3D lookup tables, and using other people's skill as a colorist to make life easier for you. So cheating, effectively, like taking your Faro ball paint and going to the color mixer at Dulux and saying, can you make me something similar? And you can get a lookup table which will give you a look, like the look of a film, The Matrix, make it greenish or bluish, or do anything else with it. Or you can just get something that gives you a neutral starting point from your log. Yeah. But in your recording, you've still got that detail. Even if you decide to crush your shadows, bring up your highlights later, you've still got the detail if you need it. So to add a 3D lookup table in DaVinci, it's very easy. You right-click on the shot, go to 3D lookup table, and as long as you've loaded that 3D lookup table into DaVinci, it's very easy. There's a folder with all the lookup tables on in the user folder on a PC. It's certainly easy to find that folder, and then you copy any you like into there, and then they'll come up in this list. So right click, tick on it, immediately it's added, and you can copy it to all the clips on the timeline, or you can just use it on individual clips. It's up to you. So lookup tables, cheat's way of getting a nice look quickly. And once you've put the lookup table on it, you can still now use the color wheels to work on your shots in much more detail. Lift is affecting the black, the dark, the shadow elements of your picture. Gamma is the midtones, and gain is your highlights. And with these color wheels, what I do is I put my mouse on it and use the mouse wheel here to subtly increase and decrease. And of course, if we've got our monitor output as well, so you're not just relying on this overlay here. You can do Control F to make that full screen, by the way. But if you've got your monitor output, you can be adjusting and looking at the same time. Now, because log files are compressed, it's not a huge amount. Even 4K stuff is working very well, or UHD stuff is working quite well. It's working quite well on the on my Mac. Sorry, on my PC, on my ZBook, which is an i7 with about 16 gig of RAM.
Yeah.
Distracted by seeing a question come in.
Yeah, it just says if you add the look by the way you've just shown us, is it applied as an input or an output?
It's as an input. You can put a lookup table on the output, on everything on the output, but I prefer doing it sort of clip by clip in a way, because sometimes you might be mixing log stuff with non-log. To be honest, it's just the way I got used to doing it. I did originally put it on the output, but you don't get so much control over it if you do that. It's sort of you're sort of spraying the whole thing with a lookup table. But that's my way of doing it. And don't forget, as I said at the beginning, this is for beginners. You may find you're happier working in a different way with DaVinci.
In your own way, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, as I say, if there's any more as we go through, please keep putting the questions through, and we'll endeavour to answer them.
You can put a lookup table on in the media bin at the very start of opening DaVinci, which is, so you can do that, have a starting point before you've even started manipulating the clips in the editor on the timeline. Mm-hmm. This is the tutorial I mentioned, which I found really useful as an end-to-end, just 36 minutes long. It will just get you started. It will stop that fear factor when you open the software and just think, I don't know what on earth I'm doing. Yeah. So download the free version of DaVinci. Don't worry if your laptop or your Mac isn't up to spec. You can see if it works. It's free. It's no hassle to give it a try, and at least you'll find out that way if you're able to work with it. Sure. So it's someone. These people also have some for sale lookup tables. They want to flog you, so that's their reasoning for giving you a free tutorial. But it's definitely the best free tutorial I found in a couple of hours of looking online. So copy that link. So RAW. So we talked about log. Going to talk in more detail about RAW here. So the RAW video, as I said at the beginning, is the sensor data before there's been any processing into it. So it's 12-bit, so there's a lot more subtlety in your colors and in your luminance levels than there is in standard 10-bit broadcast codecs. There's more information there. You'll have more levels of gradation. You can get a banding if you're looking at 8-bit footage where colors, if you've got a blue sky, it can look like there are bands. It look like somebody's painted it with slightly different color strips as it goes down. That is because there isn't a high enough bit rate. There's not enough subtleness in the transition between the colors. With 12-bit, there's a lot more subtlety. You get much nicer gradients. Although a lot of that will go away if you encode it for Vimeo and YouTube, because they're 8-bit, so you might not even see the difference. If your outputs are all for the web, probably don't bother. You're much better. You might as well shoot compressed. Okay. So RAW cannot be outputted by SDI and HDMI. So RAW is it's this dump of data straight off the sensor. So there's no way you can shove this out to a standard video recorder or a screen. You just can't see it. So remember that. Log, of course, you can output through SDI.
Yes.
And if you want to monitor log and see what it looks like, you can get monitors like there's a small HD monitor which lets you put a lookup table actually on the monitor. So you can shoot log, but you'll have a flat image on your viewfinder and on your screen, but you're actually seeing the proper gamma on a monitor on top. So you can't do that with RAW. RAW is just for internal recording. So the Blackmagic cameras use Adobe's DNG format. This is an open source format called digital negative. Now this does mean that you're able to use After Effects and Premiere with the footage from Blackmagic. You don't have to use DaVinci. So RAW video allows for more adjustment than anything else. There's no doubt about it, RAW gives you much nicer stuff.
All right, another question coming in from Chris. If you use input LUTs, don't you clip your dynamic range so the input, so you won't be able to while you're grading?
Yeah, you're right, you do, but you're immediately getting to a better solution. Yeah, I know. Here you go. This is for beginners, and you're absolutely right. That's fundamental. This is something I did when I first of all started playing with DaVinci. I immediately started putting the lookup tables on before I did anything else. And you're right, you're throwing away the extra detail. But in the case of my shot there, that's exactly what I did in order to get a simple result really quickly. I used, you can see from those two examples at exactly the same exposure that even by putting my lookup table on it, I could get that extra dynamic range. The extra dynamic range was already in the shot.
Yeah.
Now, because it was 8-bit and because it was recorded already with quite a lot of compression, you don't really want to push 8-bit log that much because you might see problems pushing, trying to pull out more detail. It might look noisy in my shadows. So because it's an 8-bit medium, I didn't have a problem with putting it on the input. But you're absolutely right. And in fact, when I talk about the RAW in a minute, I'm going to say not to do that for exactly those reasons.
Okay.
Okay. So one thing about RAW. Doesn't the Odyssey? It's not one of my products. Don't know what. Sorry, somebody's just come up with a question saying, doesn't the Odyssey 7Q record RAW from 700? I don't see how it could, but that's not something it does. How does it do that? No, not one of my products. You certainly wouldn't be able to do it with anything I've heard of.
Oh, there you go. It sends it through the SDI.
Thank you, Nick. Well, it's not something. I don't see how the raw data. So it's just using it as a data throughput. So it's not using it. Pardon?
Yeah.
So it's using the SDI as data, not as a traditional 709 gamma. Right. That's something I'm afraid I didn't know.
Okay.
It's embarrassing. Let's move on swiftly from the Odyssey, which isn't a product I've ever used. Thanks, Nick. So, talking about Blackmagic cameras and Panasonic, which do not output RAW through SDI or through HDMI, on a 256 gig card, CFast card, which the Blackmagic Ursa Mini uses and the full-size Ursa, you get 18 minutes of 4K RAW at 25 frames a second.
Right.
So 18 minutes is not a huge amount, but it's usable. But remember, the CFast 2 card, a 256 is probably at the moment costing about £600 or £700. So this is a much, much more expensive medium in the first place. The DVX200 is shooting onto SD cards, SDXC cards costing about £40 for 64 gig. And on a 64 gig card, you'll get about 50 minutes or so of 50p UHD. So an Ursa, you'll get 9 minutes at 50p on a CFast 2 card. Now, do be aware that on an Ursa, you'll need two CFast 2 cards to do 50p 4K RAW recording. What it does is it cleverly writes a frame to each card. So the data rates are so high in order to maximize the use of the cards, it writes a single frame alternately to each card, and then you copy the folders together, you copy the frames from one, and then it becomes a complete video file. So same if you're shooting on the full-size Ursa. The difference between the Ursa Mini and the full-size Ursa, or one of the differences apart from a lot of weight, is that the full-size Ursa is capable of doing 120 frames a second in RAW. And again, to do 120 frames a second in RAW 4K, you need to be using 2 cards at once because it writes as alternate frames. So, Blackmagic does have a compressed RAW format. Now, it almost sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it, to have a compressed RAW format, but it's doing a mathematical compression. It will be a tiny bit of loss. It isn't as good as doing totally uncompressed. However, we're getting much more usable data rates. You're getting 40 minutes at 25p on the same 256 gig card. So 40 minutes on 256 gig for the compressed 3:1 RAW. Now, you can use 3:1 RAW on a single CFast 2 card for 50p as well, and then you'll get 20 minutes on it. Much more usable. And just to give you a sort of indication, ProRes, which the Blackmagic's cameras also record to, ProRes 422HQ 25p is 46 minutes. So you see there's not a huge amount of difference between using the compressed RAW and using ProRes, but the compressed RAW will give you more flexibility. And again, you can record HD onto the Blackmagic cameras as well. So you're able to do 185 minutes at 25p. So if you were recording a conference, recording something like that, that's the perfect way to do it. So let me just explain this example a little bit. As you can probably guess, being a Blackmagic Ursa Mini, I've been waiting to get my hands on one of these for quite some time, and it arrived yesterday afternoon, and leaving me a few minutes to go out and grab a couple of shots. I also forgot the time difference, the fact that the hours had moved on. So when I went downstairs at 4 thinking, oh, there'll be plenty of time, I'll grab my daughter, go out, get a couple of shots. Of course, it was dark. The sun had gone down about 20 minutes earlier. So excuses given. So I just quickly went out with the Ursa Mini and took this shot in 4K RAW. Now, the way I like working with raw footage in DaVinci, I think comes from the fact I like working with raw stills in Adobe Lightroom. It's how I've become comfortable working with the raw image. So you're able to, in DaVinci, go to this raw panel. Now, if I was using log footage, all this would be blanked out. It wouldn't be giving any choice. But what I changed here, you can change the decode quality. In fact, if I wanted better playback on my laptop, which as I say is an i7, not particularly high end and about over a year old, then you can change this to half res or quarter res to give me a smoother playback of the raw image on the timeline. Now, I changed the decode to using clip from the other options here. You can use a project option, and again you could have a whole general project option, but just like Nick said earlier, your problem with using a project setting is it changes things at the start. You don't then get the freedom, you don't have the range to play with later on in the edit. So what I do is sort of clip by clip, looking at my shots, set this up exactly how I would use Adobe Lightroom in grading each of my raw stills. Now this is my, as I say, this is for beginners. This is how I have begun working with raw in DaVinci. Sure. And so it's the way I feel comfortable working. Now again, there may be much better ways of doing it, but I found this a way I can get into and start to understand the nuances of RAW much more quickly than going straight into 100 other tools which I haven't had much experience on. So here we're able to change the white balance, and you've got a terrific amount of control over the white balance. I did actually shoot this about 7500 Kelvin white balance, but it lets you change it to anything afterwards. You can literally change tungsten to a high cloud on a sunny day. You have complete control. The white balance was not relevant with RAW. It's just not important. You can change it totally afterwards, and that flexibility is something you don't get with any log footage. Now, the color space, I changed my color space. You can have a Rec 709 here, but just like Nick said, if you change it to Rec 709, then you're immediately throwing away that extra range before you even start playing. So don't do that. Keep it in the flat BMD film profile. Well, that's certainly what I found to use. And I can, after the event, after shooting it, change the ISO. And this reminds me of, you know, my old days developing and printing black and white shots. So that if you know you've underexposed a bit, you didn't quite have the light level you wanted, you could push your film a bit afterwards. Now, with DaVinci and using the raw footage, I can change my ISO after I've done the shoot, which can be fantastic. If I realize there's more information I need from my shadows and my highlights, this ability to change ISO is fundamentally good. The native ISO, by the way, on the Blackmagic Mini is 400. With the new, this will differ when we get the new 4.6 sensor a bit later this year.
Okay.
So another magic box here I ticked was the highlight recovery, because this gave me some detail which I'll just show. In fact, it's probably easier to show rather than talk. So this is my, obviously my filmic, my log raw image, and after applying these conversions to it, that was my preview image straight out.
That's incredible.
Now, I mean, you know, I can't emphasize enough, this was 20 minutes after sunset. It was cloudy anyway, and I must admit I was panicking a bit, but I needed to get something before the light totally went. My poor long-suffering daughter was freezing and being very cross with her father for dragging him outside. She's only 13, poor thing. So it was a bit hurried. I wish I'd had more chance to shoot a better example, but it at least gives you an idea. Have a look at the detail up in the highlights in the bushes above, because the highlight recovery is what gave me back a lot of that extra detail. So you can see when I go between the two that there's highlight recovery magically pulled back quite a lot of detail there, and that could be the difference, but you know, that could save a shot for you.
Yes, certainly. As I said, just looking at it here, just on standard monitor, it looks incredibly different.
And the subtlety you get in the skin tones, the subtlety in the green shadows, it reminded me how lovely it is to work with RAW. I hadn't really done much RAW recording since the original Blackmagic cinema camera, the 2.5K one, which was released in 2012. So it's been a while since I've been playing with this stuff. So other things I tweaked here, I didn't shoot. You can tweak the exposure and the sharpness. You can tweak the highlights, but I just blackened my shadows a little bit. I crushed my shadows. I didn't use an ND, no, a green tinge. It could be your monitor. To be honest, I thought it was a touch. I wasn't 100% happy with the skin tones, but I wasn't really fiddling very much in Resolve. I'll show you a little bit more fiddling in a moment. So I didn't think it was too green. To be honest, this is in my back garden after the sun's gone down, surrounded by green bushes. And imagine there's a fair bit of green reflection coming off those. So I wouldn't necessarily say I have a problem with skin tones on this.
Sure, and there's just another question coming, which is, because you can adjust so much, can you end up sort of fiddling and fiddling and fiddling, never actually complete anything?
Yes, definitely. And I have this problem with Lightroom. I showed my wife this presentation last night after we got back from watching the Bond film, which is excellent, by the way. And it was about midnight, and yes, she agreed to check it for spelling mistakes and all the things wives are much better at doing. And she said, "Oh, this is why you can never show me your photos before you've fiddled with them, isn't it? You know, everybody else with cameras just puts the JPEG straight up, but you always have to go and you call it developing them." And you're right, it takes time, but God, is it worth it? It's so worth it. Just that extra time you spend can do, can create sort of marvelous results. For instance, I started with a pretty shitty, hastily constructed, badly lit shot in my back garden late at night. I got something out of it, which is actually quite attractive. And partly thanks to my daughter, but it is possible to not only make a silk purse out of a sow's ear with RAW, but also if you've shot it well, if you've shot it nicely, if you've lit it properly, if you've exposed it well, then you can push it that much further. You can create a look or a feel which it would be impossible to do with log footage or with standard gamma footage.
Right.
So it's really flexibility, but yeah, time as well. So what I had a little play with this afterwards. So once I'd finished fiddling around with my raw settings, I then started using the color wheel settings, which is where mainly, again, due to my inexperience with DaVinci, this is mainly where I find myself. There are various settings here. That's the raw tab, and then come along to the color wheel settings in order to get this, this view here. Now, lift allows me to raise or crush my shadows, so raise detail in the black or crush them. Gamma is the midtones, allows me to change the luminance levels in the midtones. Gain allows me to change the levels in the highlights. And we can also adjust saturation here to get a more saturated look straight away. So because I've already done some of this in my raw panel, because as I say, I was happy working that way from Lightroom, then you still have room to change using your adjustments here, but it's not something which, you know, I felt comfortable adjusting from the raw flat image to get to. I much prefer doing that in the first pane. Sure. But as I say, partly down to my inexperience. I wanted to get people started with DaVinci without actually having the same fear factor that I've got. Yes. Yeah. You know, I'm not a colorist. I've never, you know, I'm a jobbing cameraman and editor at the best. So here's where I made a couple of subtle changes, and what I did really was I just pushed my my shadow detail down a little into the blue, and I pushed my gain, my highlights, to get the skin tones a bit warmer. Mm-hmm. So just to create a very simple little look, I made my highlights warmer and made my shadows bluer. And it just very quickly just shows, I didn't want to do a creative tutorial because frankly I'm not good enough with DaVinci. I'm a fiddler. I'm playing around with it. You know, in a year or two I may well get a bit better, like I can be with Photoshop and Lightroom. But at the moment I'm very early. So I don't use the log. Somebody's just come up with a question, do you use log instead of primary wheels? I don't. I use the primary wheels. Now, a colorist once told me that log is a bit of a blunt instrument. The log wheels are a bit blunt, that there's more subtlety using the primary. And as someone who is a bit too used to being using blunt instruments, I thought I'd better listen to somebody who knew what they were talking about. So sure. I don't use the log wheels, I use the primary wheels. So what I do, the way I'm adjusting it is, especially with my monitor out, everything I did was with my Ultra Studio 4K and a television. Actually, I was monitoring in HD, even though this is 4K footage. But to judge the color, I was using my television, which I trust. It's plasma, it's got rather nice color on it. And I use my mouse wheel to subtly adjust. Whoops, that of course is, as soon as I touch my mouse wheel, I'll move on to the next slide. So I'm using my mouse wheel. When you rest your mouse on the wheel here, you can subtly adjust it. But when I pushed it, I literally grabbed this bit in the middle to push it one way or the other. So if I pulled it down there, we'd get very blue looking midtones. If I pulled it up there, we'd get very warm looking midtones. Fiddle with DaVinci, play with DaVinci, watch those tutorials, get into it. You know, like I said, the whole remit for this was a beginner's guide to using RAW. You know, what are you going to find when you put the RAW footage in? How are you going to start yourself off playing with it? So, sure. So I hope that's what I've achieved. And yes, I've now learned something about convergent design products, which I didn't know before. But yes, I apologise for the missteer on STI RAW, but it's certainly true with the Blackmagic cameras. You can't output RAW through STI on those. Okay. So yeah, other things you can play with. This is the noise reduction palette. So if I push this too far, if I had noise in my blacks, I'd be able to use the temporal noise reduction to get rid of the noise very efficiently and evenly. And you will get the full version of DaVinci when you buy the Blackmagic cinema cameras. You can also play with sharpness. The sharpness can just pluck out more detail. Again, when you're shooting raw, it's very easy to add sharpness without, because of the extra nuances and subtlety in the raw files, you can pull a lot more detail out than you think you can. It's an interesting, so you can just, again, hover your mouse over and pull the radius downwards to get sharper footage, push it up to get softer, a sort of softer look. And watch that tutorial. You'll get a lot out of it.
Yeah.
Right, so to sum up, to work with RAW, or what you get is a huge amount of flexibility in post-production, the ability to rescue a shot you might not think is rescuable, using things like the highlight, pulling your highlights back, or getting more detail in the shadows. The ability to change ISO and white balance after shooting, fundamental. It's the cameraman's time machine to go back when you know you got it wrong and change it. Get more detail as well, again using sharpness or using a highlight recovery, a way of getting as much detail as possible out of your shots. And to work with RAW, what you're going to need is, certainly with the Ursa cameras, a decent amount of CFast storage. So if you're shooting RAW, even the compressed RAW, you're going to be burning through cards. You can, of course, shoot to a card, copy the footage off, and then shoot to another card again. But you do need to take this into account. £700 for 256 compared with £40 for a 64 gig, which will hold almost more footage on a camera like a Panasonic DVX. So consider the time you're shooting before you make those choices. You'll also need a recent and decent Mac or PC. I said I'd talk a bit more about specifications. Blackmagic on their website actually have a link to, I think they call it a cookbook or a recommended system guide or something like this. So have a look at what they recommend in order to edit 4K. It's a little on the pessimistic side. You can get away with less. For instance, you can get away with some of the very high-end NVIDIA game cards, the same things that will play Call of Duty at 100 frames a second, will actually be fantastic for 4K grading. So and these gaming cards are cheaper than some of the top-of-the-range Quadro NVIDIA cards. So do a bit of research, find out the best sort of graphics card for these, but NVIDIA do tend to give better results, certainly on a PC platform. A Mac Pro is recommended on shooting on editing 4K on a Mac side, the new dusty bin type of Mac, because you need grunt, you need power, and it has actually been optimized. Although there are ATI graphics in that, it is optimized to work for 4K, so you will get good results with that. So big, fast hard drives. The only reason I'm able to work with log on my laptop is because I've got SSD in my laptop. It eats it up, but you do need very, very fast in order to play it off smoothly and reliably. Because it takes up so much room, even copying it would take ages if you didn't have SSD, if you had old spinning disks. So think about that. You can, of course, upgrade to add these. And the final thing, Rob, you mentioned it earlier, time. Because you can fiddle so much, you always need the extra time to be creative, to pull more detail out, you've got so much artistic choice, and sometimes choice is a huge waste of time for you. It's a much better idea to go in thinking what sort of look you want to get out of it. And I'll put up the tutorial link again, because it was certainly the best 36 minutes I'd spent in trying to find out about DaVinci 12. So somebody's just asked, can I put it up again? And I did at the end, actually. Oh, no, I'll come back to that in a minute. Let me just say, to see a proper colorist, I'm very much a jack of all trades. My job, my responsibilities across the whole range of what Holdan do, from MPEG encoders to cameras and vision mixers. So I have a little bit of knowledge about a lot, rather than an engineer or a colorist who knows absolutely everything about a very small amount. So come along to the 1st of December Blackmagic Day here, where Simon is a colorist who will take you through the nuances, put you right on everything I got wrong, and show you working with some decent Blackmagic camera footage, so you can see exactly how far you can push and pull this stuff. So it's Tuesday, 1st of December. Now, here's, for the person who asked, I actually did this before. I put the link up again because it is such a good tutorial, and you probably feel cheated by mine. So here's the link to that. It's a shame that the links don't exactly work on the webinars, but you know, take a quick frame of it or watch it on the replay. If you just search ground control DaVinci 12 basics, I'm sure you'll find it. It was about, you know, half an hour searching stuff. I went on searching afterwards. I didn't find anything as good as this, as nicely presented. And it takes you from importing your footage all the way through to exporting. Because of course, if you're not going to edit in DaVinci, you might be just pulling clips into DaVinci, working on them and exporting them, or you can, with Final Cut, you can import a whole project. You can into DaVinci and export a project into Final Cut. It's called round tripping. It's a way of working with two editing packages. So you're exporting a project, so you're not having to colorize, you're not having to process every single bit of the video. Yeah. You're only working on the bits you've used. It's like an offline online, but in grading. But because DaVinci's editing features are so good now, you ought to consider doing your edits in DaVinci. I think you'll find it's quite impressive.
Sure. Okay, and finally, has anyone got any questions? There've been quite a few coming through, and we've answered them as we went through the presentation. But has anyone else got any questions? Now is your time, because we're going to be wrapping up in the next 30 seconds, a minute or so. So if you've got any questions, please ask them. If not, you can always email me. We've got one in. How to import raw files to a timeline.
In DaVinci, yes, if you want to import raw files into a timeline, if you want to do it into DaVinci, you just use the media import tool at the start. So as soon as if you're in DaVinci, let me just come back to, I got a screenshot. Right, there we go. You see there's a media tab, an edit tab, and this is one of the reasons why I didn't have time to go into exactly how you bring them in. But if you just copy them to a hard drive, go to the media tab there, go to the media tab here in DaVinci, it will just let you drag and drop the raw file straight into a project. Then you go to edit and you create a timeline where you've got the clips which you've just dragged and dropped onto a timeline. Suddenly then they're available in color for you to tweak in any way you like. So you start with media, very simple, drag and drop. Because Blackmagic make DaVinci and Blackmagic make the cameras as well, it could not be easier to work with the raw footage than it is in DaVinci. Now when you're using the raw in Adobe, in After Effects, I believe it brings up the raw import panel when you try to load it, but I haven't got a copy or a current copy of the Creative Cloud. I got fed up with renting, so I'm afraid I've only got DaVinci to play with it, but I believe it brings up a raw panel and lets you do basic correction before you start, but you'll find it very easy to use raw in DaVinci.
Okay, thanks for that question. Hopefully that's given you an insight into, a brief insight which you can then expand on, either coming here to Teddington Visual Impact or on our open. And the first, we have one more, in fact, two more questions just to go through.
Yeah, sure. The best and fastest way to create a timeline is now in the edit. You just drag straight from your library straight onto the timeline, and you get I wish I could show this, it would be a lot easier, but literally grab your shots from your media project, drop them straight onto a timeline, and it creates a new timeline with those clips in it. Excellent. Drag and drop, that's the easiest way. It was more difficult with previous versions, but with 12 it's become very, very simple. Any advice on better integrated workshop? Have a look, it's awful, but read the manual on the round tripping. There are very good ways to work with Final Cut and Premiere for integrating your workflow with DaVinci Resolve. It's in the manual. You can download the manual. Remember, this is a free version, so just download it, have a look at the round tripping. You probably find a tutorial on round tripping, but I couldn't find anything. Round tripping is when you start in the edit, go to DaVinci and come back again, or start in DaVinci and go to the edit program and come back again for finishing. So you can do it, but it's beyond the scope of me to tell you how over this.
Yeah, sure.
Should I use FCP or Premiere with DaVinci Raw? Right. That's really up to you. I think it will work with both. It will work with both Adobe. I know that the round tripping's probably had more work put into it with Final Cut Pro because Adobe have their own grading. They probably aren't struggling to make things work perfectly fluidly with a third-party editing program, especially one that's given away. So I would imagine FCP is probably the better choice for that. Okay. What's the name of the TV Simple card? It's called the Intensity Pro 4K. Sorry, the Intensity 4K, and it's look for Blackmagic Intensity 4K. Brilliant little device, will give you UHD through HDMI monitoring out of DaVinci, even in 10-bit actually.
Brilliant. Okay, I think that seems to be the end of the questions, and we're coming to the end of our time. No, there's another one come in just in time.
Yeah, it does. Yes, you can do exactly the same round tripping with Avid that you can with Final Cut. So I believe you work with the XML files, but I'd need to have 5 minutes with Google to find that out.
Brilliant. Okay. And
Edius 8, great for round tripping. I really like working with Edius 8. So yes, you can. Again, you can do an XML-based round trip with Edius. To be honest, because of all the mucking about with round tripping, you're right, sorry, AF, thank you very much. For all the round tripping stuff, I actually would prefer to process my files I want to use in DaVinci, output them, and then use them in my editing package in that standard way. If I had short clips, I had a short project, I'd probably work that way. I'd process them through DaVinci, export them as new files, and for Edius, you can export them as QuickTime Grass Valley HQX files, which will give you perfect files which are very Edius compatible for working with. So perhaps consider for Edius, import into DaVinci, work in DaVinci, get your color as perfect as you can, then export HQX files into Edius.
Excellent. Okay. Well, I think we should wrap it up now. Thanks very much, Richard. That was really enlightening, and as I said, hopefully it got over a few nerves from people who are basically cameramen and want to get into RAW, not colorists, but want to put a step into it. So I really appreciate that. You logging on and joining and listening to us today, and as I say, interacting with plenty of questions, which is what we like to see. So thanks again. We'll have lots more webinars and events through November and December. Please log on to our website and look at the events page. Thanks again, Richard. Thank you all for joining in and listening, and bye for now. Thank you.